Ignore that. Or don't. One of the inaugural courses from the Bernt Peterson Academy was an introduction to psychology. I am a cognitive psychologist, PhD. I have also taught intro psych, and I have now completed the Academy's course. Does it stack up, or does it miss the mark? And is it worth that $600 a year price tag? Where are you going? This video is made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! And also Tobi. Not so Tobi. Yeah. If this is the first you're hearing about the Peterson Academy, I have a video about the state of the website, or online learning platform, when it went into early access last August, and it's also linked in the description. We'll quickly revisit the sales pitch here, and I'll give you an update on what's changed after we talk about intro psych. All of this is the Peterson Academy splash page or landing page when you're not signed in or if you haven't purchased access yet. The front and center pitch is, quote, education devoid of ideology for an affordable $600 a year. Note, dear viewer, that is higher than the $450 I paid for early access. In fairness to them, I was notified about the price bump before it happened and was given the opportunity to lock in at a lower price. In any event, there are currently 35 8-hour courses with the promise of 4 more added each month. They have kept to that rate so far. Peterson himself is now up to 3 courses, ranging from Nietzsche to the Bible to something he's actually trained in, personality psychology. There's some glowing user reviews, although I am curious if Jason here is shopping at Erewhon or something, if his, quote, 3 days worth of groceries is $600. Seriously. I made my script reviewer go to the site and make sure I wasn't being dumb and reading that wrong, because that's $200 a day. Or even if it was like the $450 price, that was $150 a day. And just how? We went to the Erewhon website and no. So maybe he's eating out 3 times a day and then like at a really nice place, or maybe he's got like 10 kids or something. Like, just how? A new promise since launch is that you will, quote, master every discipline. As you'll see when we get to the Academy update, I'm still skeptical about this claim. They've built it to run on all the usual devices. No word yet if they're working on the fridge version. It is a bit of a social media site, so you have a profile of things. The testing is optional, but don't you worry if you choose to do them. They're using, quote, advanced AI-based quizzes and exams tailored to challenge, engage, and teach you. I will definitely have some more to say about those, at least for what I saw in intro psych. Note that I had taken the quizzes at launch and the final recently when it became available. Once again, it is a social media site, so join up and connect with that motivated community. While some of the content creators are indeed professors from the schools listed, I don't think it's fair to say that the courses themselves are affiliated with those schools, and the schools might be a bit horrified to be associated with this endeavor. Also, there are plenty of courses from people unaffiliated with higher ed. All this can be yours for just $600 a year. So, you know, let's skip those lattes for a couple months and you can pay for it. As mentioned at the start, we'll revisit and update how the website's doing after talking about intro psych. As for what we'll be talking about for intro psych, we'll start with the information provided by the website about this course, then go on to what's usually covered for intro psych versus what's included here, then round things out with a objective-ish measure of how well I think this did at teaching the viewer intro psych. Course info from the website. Information about the instructors and the courses is now available just on the website. You don't have to purchase access, which is a welcome change from all of that being paywalled at launch. Dr. Keith Campbell has a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Florida. Trivia we get during the intro psych videos. He's dug the deepest into narcissism, and if you'd like to as well, you can pick up his latest book about the topic. This was a quibble I had with the course offering at launch. Many of the specialized courses seem to be very linked to non-academic airport books by the content creators. And yeah, some profs will include a book they've written as part of their required reading for a college course, but those tend to be written for an academic audience or just textbooks, not something written for the general readership. It's a different vibe, is all I'm saying. I've only gone through his intro psych series, but I imagine this is true for the narcissism one as well. Dr. Campbell has a very friendly and generally excited lecturing presence. In some ways, he reminds me a lot of one of my husband's coworkers, who's from roughly the same time and place as Campbell. Very laid-back, Californian, yeah, you do you, man. It's all wrong, but it's all right.
If I woke up and said, you know what, my kids love me, people at work respect me, I'm like, dude, put that on my tombstone and call it a life, right? That's great.
And Campbell mentioned being a Grateful Dead head and seeing them in like Berkeley and whatever, so we are honoring and holding space for that by wearing tie-dye, which can be yours at my merch shop, link below. In the videos, in the white void, he is only lecturing at the students. Other content creators make use of whiteboards or projected slides. Campbell is going for a much more minimalist approach. This lecture style can work for some topics. For example, my favorite professor in undergrad, who I probably had not quite half of my psych courses from, taught this way. But part of why he did that is some years prior he had a stroke that knocked out proprioception for half his body. What that means is he couldn't just sense what his body was up to and where it was in space. And he had a lot of coping strategies for this, like keeping the hand under check. But there's every now and then his attention would wander, coping strategy would not be adhered to, and his arm just float up behind him and kind of be in orbit above his head. And you'd usually notice because probably all of us were like, and so, oh, right, and then grab it and bring it back down. The thing about lecturing without the use of anything is it makes it harder for students to build an information framework of what's being talked about, as well as visual representations of what's being discussed. In intro psych, especially the parts Campbell covered, missing visuals isn't the end of the world, as opposed to another course, Intro to Neuroscience. That course is suffering from a lack of useful and appropriate graphics. An important tool that proper college courses have that the Peterson Academy experience is missing is a textbook that's been integrated into the course. This can help students build that informational framework that is really kind of critical for us when learning this sort of new information. Lets them hang new stuff on it, organize it, useful, as well as provide useful graphics. As for the course itself, it's amusingly actually called Intro to Psychology. If you couldn't tell, I generally informally call it Intro Psych, but in college course catalogs, it'll formally be called Introduction to Psychology. Anyway, quote, in Intro to Psychology, a 9-hour course, Dr. Campbell takes us on an exploration of the diverse field of psychology, from its historical roots to its modern applications. We examine how humans make sense of the world through mental models, cognitive biases, and social influences, and delve into the psychology of human development, personality, relationships, and mental health. Dr. Campbell concludes by highlighting the powerful impact of social psychology on individual behavior and the importance of navigating social influences wisely in an increasingly complex world. Before we get into the specifics of Intro Psych, I just wanted to say something nice about Campbell's videos. Through the video series, he'll sprinkle in little bits of broader life advice. And here's 3 of the bunch, seemingly contradicting Peterson's parenting advice.
You don't make your kids want to explore. You don't beat your kids and make them fearful in order to make them go out and explore. You just tell them they're loved and they're willing to do it.
From the video on personality psychology, a much needed message in these chaotic times.
People are just different. People are different, and those differences matter. Those differences make a difference.
And from the final video on social navigation, some advice on how to resist social pressure, as he emphasized we're hardwired to want others to like us.
If you don't want to be influenced, be comfortable not being liked. Be a little disagreeable, because if you're too agreeable, you know, it's hard to resist.
It's probably fair to say that I agree with Campbell on many things, the utility of Freud being a glaring exception. But the time constraints and format are not conducive to what this thing is being sold as, which is quite possibly more Peterson's fault than his. And so it cannot be said that I had nothing nice to say about Campbell's intro vids, which I just wanted to emphasize because now we are going to get into the much more substantial critical mass. Introduction to Psychology course content. The largest criticism I have of this Intro to Psychology video series is that it only covers a subset of all of psychology. This could be chalked up to individual differences in what different instructors feel is important to emphasize, but I would argue that for an introductory course, you're doing everybody a disservice by specializing as much as Campbell did. So to illustrate this, we're going to start with how I've seen and taught Intro Psych versus what is included in Campbell's video series. Also at the top, let me just say I do not consider myself the definitive source on Intro Psych, academic freedom and how we teach and all of that. But I have taught Intro Psych as well as higher level psych courses and interacted with psychologists out in the wild. And if someone's intro was lacking, it'll show. In my experience, this can range from needing to teach psychology students at a higher level, things they really should have learned in intro, just should have been drilled in them, all the way to having to explain to a PsyD what cognitive psychology is as a concept. PsyD being a terminal degree, so sort of like a PhD, that is thesis-free and relatively science-light, typically received by counseling students, but sometimes clinical as well. Tried to think how best to illustrate everything I covered when I taught Intro Psych, which is pretty close to other versions I've seen prior to this. And I think the easiest and clearest demonstration is just to show you the schedule from my syllabus. For whatever reason, the place I adjuncted at split Intro Psych into 2 semesters, but somehow kept the time spent physically in class the same as the 1 semester version. So don't ask me, I have zero clue, the cats are being crazy. It was a weird school, but just that is why there's 2 semesters here. We start things off with the big picture of what psychology is and hit the high points of the field's history. Up next is the research methods chapter, where we, admittedly, speed through how one does the science, some basic statistics, and a primer on how to read plots because there are lots of plots in Intro Psych. Chapter 3 is on neuropsych, and 4 is sensation and perception. Skipping a couple chapters, we next learn about learning. This includes classical and operant conditioning, as well as me squeezing in one of my research interests, implicit and explicit learning. Put a pin in that. Instructors spending extra time and care on their research interests. That is followed by the emotion and motivation chapter. Emotion and motivation, both. Then for the 4th test, we hit the Well, we're gonna wrestle in my office. No, keep going. Don't let me stop you. And towels are for sound dampening. Then for the 4th test, we hit the cognitive chapters. Memory, which included attention because, again, one of my research interests, then language and thought, with thinking encompassing categorization, decision-making, problem-solving, and metacognition. The 2nd semester kicks off with consciousness. One day in there, more than a day actually, was devoted to substances that alter your consciousness, as a super brief info dump on how the different chemicals work, the psychopharmacology, and importantly, side effects and long-term consequences. These guys were fresh into adulthood, and if they're going to play around with that stuff, I want them to be informed while they did it. Then there's the chapters on intelligence, personality, and social psychology. We close out the course by talking about the psychological disorders and the many ways they can be treated, human development, and finally, the chapter on stress. For actual timing of things, each class had roughly an hour of lecturing. As you can see, most topics got 2 lecture sessions, with some getting 2.5. Only consciousness and psych disorders got a full 3. You can also see how important I think testing is, as students would take a total of 8 in-class exams in addition to the midterm and final. There were also online quizzes. I tried to have at least 12 each semester, and I'd only keep the highest 10 scores, and they just needed to take these after the lecture at some point before the next class. As discussed in my How to Study video, testing is a really important part of the learning process, especially in psychology. So for more info on that, check out that video. With that done, it's time to talk about what Campbell talked about in this video series. As we go through his videos, I'll have this table on screen of everything I covered in my intro psych so we can check things off as we go. Also, as an editorial note, I will be cutting out pauses or stutters, word or phrase repetitions, just speaking quirks that come in to get the ideas to flow as efficiently as possible. And this is not intended to be a critique or slight against Campbell. Doing it live ends up being a lot less polished than something that you can edit when you put it up on YouTube. Video 1, Roots of Psychology. Campbell starts with the definition of psych, as we all do. But his definition is wildly different than the one I use. From an old lecture slide, Mine is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes and how they are affected by an organism's physical or mental state and the external environment, with a little elaboration here about what is meant by behavior and mental processes. His?
Psychology comes from two words, psyche, which means soul, the ancient Greek word, and logos, which is the rational study of.
He clarifies that we're not really studying souls, rather the human condition and whatnot. However, I feel this is a fair point to complain about because the final uses the rational study of the soul definition. Moving on. He goes through the ancient Greek roots, in particular Plato, then works up to the Renaissance and post-Golden Age. Well, Descartes. Out of everybody, he only talks about Descartes. Screw Bacon and Locke, I guess. He has some choice descriptives about the founder of psychology, saying,
You ask people who really started this ball rolling. He's not my favorite guy, but he probably gets the credit for it. Is Wilhelm Wundt.
Why not Campbell? Is it because he's an experimentalist and not faffing about in the unconscious? First lecture in, and I'm already this grumpy. Campbell jumps around a bit chronologically, going from the US tradition founded by William James, to Freud, to the philosophers Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Would you believe these people never came up in my class? To Pavlov, to the behaviorists. He spends a bit of time on the early parts of social psych before zooming past humanistic psychology and touches on the cognitive revolution and neuropsych. His way of breaking down the different branches of psychology is the use of levels of analysis, with an example of examining depression at a genetic, neurotransmitter, or anatomical, physiological, attitudinal, personality, and social perspectives. While this does illustrate some of the different ways we can approach topics, it doesn't really inform students about what exactly is going on in the different branches of psych. General complaint I'd have about Campbell's teaching style is, in my opinion, he will introduce a topic, give an example of what that topic looks like, then move on. In my opinion, that is not a particularly useful way to teach, especially in an introductory class. When you're sitting there in class, it might feel like you got the information you needed from this example, but when you need to use it later, either for a quiz or test or an actual application, unless you're able to glean the point or the definition from that example, you're going to have to reverse engineer what those were from that example, assuming you can even remember it at that point. Since I'm also deep in example territory, I dug out my trusty old teaching sweater to show you by way of another illustration. Just bear with me. After going through the historical roots for psychology, we go through the modern state of the field. And the way I think of this is breaking it down into 4 subfields. This is my analog for his levels of analysis thing. We have the basic research branches, where we're doing the purest psych possible, because we are in there doing experiments, manipulating independent variables, and seeing what happens with the dependent variables. So this includes everything on screen, like biological, cognitive, developmental, personality, and social psychology, as well as things like perception or neuro. Basic experimental psych. If you want to scale things up and test more real-world problems, then we're talking about applied research. And so you're still doing science for most part, but now you're trying to solve real-world problems. So this includes human factors, which is called all kinds of things, IO psych, health, environmental, social, and at least like the basic fields for particularly crafty psychologists who want to scale up their basic research to real-world problems. Usually this means that you are leaving your nice little safe lab environment and taking it into real-world settings, but if you have something like a driving simulator, you can do this still in the lab. Somewhat separate from those are the treating branches, meaning clinical and counseling psychology. Clinical focuses more on the disordered range of things, and counseling is more on average, normal, everyday problems. Finally, there's psychiatry, which is a branch of medicine that deals with psychological things, like usually psych disorders, but it can be for other things as well. So we're both kinda talking about the same stuff. I'm just being much more explicit and comprehensive about it, as opposed to...
So that's what's going on with psychology. It's just massive, and we're studying things at lots of different levels.
Going back to the table, we somewhat covered similar ground at the start. Kinda. Still in video 1, we get the little bit for research methods, starting with,
I think what holds psychology together, what makes it psychology and not something else, is the scientific method. Is that we're all trained to do science. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean I'm the science.
And what is science, Dr. Campbell?
It means there's a certain way we go about defining problems, defining what we're studying, and then looking at how we're studying.
He follows this up with non-defining examples. Or we could just define what the scientific method is, and then go through the usual process, identifying important concepts along the way. It is really not my intent to keep going back to my lectures. I'm going to knock it off because I think my point's been made. But this is so frustrating to watch as an instructor who's covered the same material. I will, however, be persnickety about the thing holding psychology together being that we're trained in science as opposed to things that actually hold psychology together. Seriously. His definition would lump biology, chemistry, physics, and everything else in a school of natural sciences under the psych umbrella. Bad definition is bad. We're just going to go to the table for this. He allocates all of 12 minutes to the science part of psych, so I'm feeling spicy. Scientific method. Not really. Types of experiments, meaning things like case studies, surveys, correlational studies, and experiments. Only in that talking around kind of way, with the example being the relationship between sun exposure and happiness, and trying to make it work for all those different levels of analysis. He doesn't talk about variables or procedural details like random assignment or double blinding, nor the history of research ethics, or the very, very basic level of stats an intro-psych student should know to navigate the material. Random complaint. The second video isn't captioned on the platform, so we're gonna make do. The second video is called Mental Models and Sense Making. From the description, it sounds like it should cover some perception and cognitive territory. Right? Even though I'd already taken the quizzes, so had a rough idea of what's going to be covered, I was still optimistic when he started this video by talking about how our perception of things isn't a full depiction of what's present in the world, such as our insensitivity to UV light. Also, the filtering of info coming in. But then...
And so what we have is the gap between the thing in itself and this little model of the mind. In psychology, we call this sensation and perception.
He goes on to sort of define sensation and perception, mostly centered on broad visual processing, then onto a couple illusions, and that is it for perception. So that's a no for most of that chapter. Following that is a highly simplified and so kind of incorrect mention of attention.
So our attentional system is very selective. It's almost like a light beam. And so we attend to the things we're supposed to attend to, and stuff that we're not supposed to attend to, we just don't see at all.
The pop-up at least tries to give a definition for attention. Eventually, his next point is on the two processing types, and he lumps way too many things into those different bins, and I am doing the thing I always do. Getting absolutely lost in the wigs. I'm lost in the wigs. Sure, leaving it in. We're lost in the wigs and losing sight of the bigger picture. And y'all ain't here for a multi-hour discussion of the minimally sufficient information for intro psych. Well, some of you are. That is not my purpose here today, so we're gonna hit the main points of what he covered. Campbell talks about automatic and controlled processing. Somehow not talking about Stroop effect, but whatever. He touches on some of Kahneman's work, being the rare cognitive psych guy to win a Nobel Prize in economics. So even though Campbell doesn't talk about algorithms at all and omits most of the intro psych standard heuristics, we'll give him this as included. Then he's got scripts as a part of schemas, which would also fit into decision making and heuristics. Priming, when I've taught it, fits into one small part of retrieval, so we'll just highlight part of that word here. Sometime later, Campbell gets to cognitive dissonance, which I've usually seen as a part of social psych, but that's okay. We're putting this under a portion of attitudes and actions, so again, partially highlighting here is covered. He continues to hang out in social psych with social proof, which isn't something I or my textbook covered. Guess I'll make him his own little box for that. Continuing in social, Campbell talks about the influence of others on our perceptions, which fell under conformity when I did it. The lecture portion of this video closes out with him talking about how to combat biases and heuristics, going back to controlled processing. The end of this video features a Q&A session with those in attendance, either asking for clarification on a topic or probing something further. It seems like they made the editorial decision to include the Q&A session at the end of the latter video instead of divvying up the questions based on which video they were in. The third video is on human development. We get some Freud, which I cover this in personality, that's okay. Then some Bowlby for attachment types, Piaget for a more cognitive skills perspective, Kohlberg for morality development, and Erikson for a stage model based on developmental challenges. I don't really have much to say here, other than noting that he didn't talk about prenatal development, Harlow's monkey experiments with wire or cloth mothers, parenting styles, and the changing cognitive aspects of adulthood, especially later adulthood. The fourth video is about motivation, and motivation only, no emotion. He definitely hits on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Something else to add to Campbell's box are the big three motives. That wasn't covered by me or my book. But he doesn't talk about instincts, incentives, hunger, or sex drive, sexual response, or sexualities, so... But Campbell goes far deeper into the tippy top of Maslow's hierarchy than I ever did. He discusses flow states, which I'm surprised to not find in my lecture notes. Guess that's going in Campbell's box too. He closes this video out by talking about happiness. Part of his discussion fits into the coping part of stress, but most of this is more along the lines of self-actualization, so we'll put happiness motive in Campbell's box. The self is the focus of the fifth video, specifically a person's personality. The majority of this video is on traits and the big 5-factor model of personality. He also talks about William James's I versus me self, something that I've seen covered in history, but James's part of the self-concept is in personality, as is self-esteem. While I spent a little time talking about stereotype threat, I did not talk about imposter syndrome, so into the Campbell box that goes. Same for narratives. And I know this might shock long-term viewers, but I don't talk about the hero's journey in my intro Psych class. It is not going in the box. Sorry, not sorry. Video 6 is on love and attraction. To be super brief here, the only overlap between us is in parts of attraction. We're going to populate the Campbell box a bit because this was only a small subsection in my social lecture. I didn't cover the personal psychological shift in a relationship, models of love, or how to maintain a committed relationship. You only have so much class time to lecture, and those weren't things I wanted to cover. In the interest of covering things like, the brain, the 7th video is labeled mental health, but it's primarily about psychological disorders. Feels a little disingenuous to call it mental health when it's more about clinical disorders, but that might not have been up to him. He uses a different definition of disordered than I do, which is fine, although he doesn't do much of anything on history. As noted here, he uses the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology or high top model. And that isn't going to go in my Campbell box, because that model came out after I had literally moved away from adjuncting. If we're moving away from the DSM or ICD disorder classification systems, I'm personally more fond of the National Institute of Mental Health's Research Domain Criteria, or RDoC, but that and the high top are both still works in progress. Anywho, he only covers a subset of what I've typically seen in intro, and besides the anxiety and mood disorders, plus a couple personality disorders, he doesn't go into much detail for what is included, nor legal or social impacts or perspectives. Womp womp. The back third of this video is a scattershot of treatment options. While he does talk about the psychoanalytic and cognitive behavioral approaches, plus a little about medications, group therapy, and ECT, he doesn't talk about all the other things I covered in that chapter. The final video of this series rounds out the things he hadn't previously covered about social psych: persuasion, conformity, compliance, obedience, and group effects. Of those, I didn't explicitly cover compliance. Where does that leave things? Well, if my rough outline's anything to go off of, huge chunks of material normally covered in intro psych wasn't. All of neuro and the majority of cognitive and perception went undiscussed. I'll argue through the rationale of doing this in the next section, so for now, add this to the previous pinned idea. So I printed off the study guide I had for my classes, and while watching the videos, I went through and checked things off that he covered or wrote things in that he did that I didn't. And it's a lot of blank pages here. However, a more compelling demonstration would be to see how a hypothetical Peterson Academy student would do on a average, general, more broad intro psych final exam. like mine. This is the last intro psych final I gave. All 200 questions of it because administration got mad if your final was too short. But hey, first question's a gimme. You get a full half percentage point for correctly identifying which version of the test you have. Version A, Bubble A. Wow! Something some students managed to not do correctly after having to do this for the previous 9 tests. The way I set about doing this, I ended up with 3 categories. First, topics or concepts that were covered by Campbell will get a green check mark, correct, and pretend this isn't the gimme. Students with perfect recall of what was covered in the video series would be able to answer this correctly. Like question 57. Which cluster of psychology focuses on the medical treatment of psychological disorders? Basic psychology, applied psychology, counseling psychology, or psychiatry? I tried to be generous with what I included here. So this includes questions where the info for the correct answer wasn't explicitly covered in the video, but the student might be able to suss out based on some of the answers being covered and being incorrect. Also, if Campbell offhandedly mentioned it in an aside, I marked it as correct, even though the student would have had to be paying microscopically close attention to be able to use that on the final. Basically, understand that I was trying to give every benefit of doubt here. The other easy category were things not covered by Campbell, and likely either too jargony or obscure for the student to be able to guess based on general knowledge. I just so happen to have a handy example in the next question. The type of attention associated with tasks that involve higher attentional processes, like the Stroop task, is alerting attention, executive attention, orienting attention, or otter attention. Sometimes when you can't come up with a good distracting stem, leaf I think they're called, alternate answer, I would just make up something funny, because, why not? But students would still bubble that one in as correct sometimes. Back on topic. There is little chance a Peterson Academy student would be able to correctly answer that based on what Campbell said. Then there is the complicated category that's basically just catching everything in between those two. This includes questions or answers where he talked about some of the people or concepts involved, so the attentive student might be able to work out an answer through a process of elimination. So this is different than the correct version of this, because in this case, a student might only be able to knock out 1 or 2 of the alternatives instead of 3. Things that showed up once in the videos as part of an aside, but weren't labeled, defined, or usefully specified. Like, he mentioned Carl Rogers once, a top dog for the humanist approach to psychology, with no elaboration. And finally, questions where the student might be able to work out the correct answer just from general knowledge. So, we've got questions that would be answerable from the Peterson Academy intro psych content, questions that would be highly improbable to get correct, and questions in a sort of gray space between. Time for some math. And I have the totals on screen now. Of the 200 final questions, 45 were covered, 128 were not, and 27 were in that middle space. From here, there's a couple ways we could grade things. If we are only looking at and scoring questions with content that was explicitly included, that works out to roughly a 23% on the final. Not good. Not good at all. And coming up with the final score though, we should take into account the odds of a student being able to get lucky in guessing. The final questions are multiple choice with 4 answers to choose from. It's statistically likely that for the not covered items, a student could luck their way into getting roughly 25% of them correct. With that, the potential final exam scores bumped up to 42%. Definitely better than 23, but still not passing. There's one final Hail Mary we can do here on behalf of Campbell and the Peterson Academy. For those in-between gray items, we could make the assumption that the student could knock out, let's say, half the alternatives and boost their chances of guessing correctly up to 50%. If we rerun those numbers, that boosts the final exam score up to roughly 46%. Fail! Conclusions about Introduction to Psychology. All these scores, particularly that first one, are giving a rough idea of how much intro psych ground was covered in these videos, which maps pretty well onto the table of material we went through while reviewing the video's content. Personally, I'm a bit horrified by the gaps here. I don't think it's an outrageous expectation to at least make an attempt at representing all of psychology. Like, Cognitive and a bit of perception and neuro is my bread and butter, but I still covered the other stuff because students should get an introduction to psychology. Why is this course so specialized? My initial inclination was to chalk this up to two things. First, that pinned idea of instructors giving extra love to topics that fall in their research interests, like me shoving attention into the memory discussion, even though it's separate things. And second, a general laziness known to afflict academics. We will recycle any and everything if it means having to do less work. Honestly, maybe those still fit what I dug up. Campbell's institution, the University of Georgia, has a pretty extensive catalog of course syllabi. Here's what came up for Campbell. Note that these date back to 2010. If I had to guess, that's when he started there, after completing his postdoc. Here I've got the table sorted by course. In lieu of listing out the 5 different courses he's got syllabi for, let me just say that none of these are intro psych. Personality, social, and narcissism, sure, but no intro. Just to make sure Georgia doesn't have a weird take on intro psych, I pulled a couple current syllabi. Naturally, they're using a different text, but the coverage looks roughly equivalent to mine. Little time given to the different branches of psych, as covered in the intro psych text. Given all that, I would guess that Campbell pulled this material together specifically for the Peterson Academy. It seems unlikely that he would have recycled content from his personality and social psych classes, given the much more rapid pace of the Peterson Academy. But for someone specialized into this material, probably wouldn't be terribly hard to distill things down into the 9 hours of Peterson Academy lecture time. However, it is absurd to advertise this video series as, quote, an exploration of the diverse field of psychology from its historical roots to its modern applications. Maybe he thought briefly touching on some visual illusions or cognitive biases would be sufficient to check perception and cognitive off the list. I really can't say. What I can say is this: ain't it, Chief? Just to say nothing of the errors or admittedly at the time possibly wrong trivia just randomly thrown in by Campbell. Patrons, let me know if you want a gory detailing of all of that. That would be something I could throw together next week while my throat's recovering from a follow-up endoscopy. Yeah! If this is any indication of what we can expect from the other intro series or more specialized topics... Uh-oh. Updates for the Peterson Academy experience. Let's look at what's new or has changed since the Peterson Academy was in early access, starting with the complaints or concerns I noted in the launch video. As mentioned earlier, potential users are now able to see all the information about courses and instructors and not having to pay for that access. Previously, you only had access to the teaser trailer. Good change. The course listing still lacks any sort of organizational structure. It's just a random hodgepodge of everything available. You are able to flag courses as ones you're taking, and after you've taken the final, it moves to a separate shelf, which is nice, but it would be really helpful to have any sort of organization happening. Maybe they aren't keen on doing that just yet because it would show how scattered and, I don't know, biased isn't the right word, unequally distributed the representation is right now. I can't speak to an improvement in the AI quizzes, as once you take them, you're done. However, the final was not free of problems. I spotted at least one typo. Apophenia is missing a P, and apohenia isn't a thing. There was a question in the form I absolutely loathe. This isn't as egregious as some I've seen, like asking what the background slide color was for the Alzheimer's slide. These sorts of questions are asking more about the student's notes and the format, or just printing out the slides, instead of the content itself. I don't think it's reasonable to expect students to remember the order 3 diagnostic criteria were presented in. Bad question. And then there's some questions which a student paying half attention could answer, as most of the alternatives weren't discussed in the videos. I'm not saying every question should be an A-breaker, but come on, keep them a little challenging. What's here still doesn't match the promise of a world-class education. It doesn't even reach the level of a general degree. Now's a good time to pivot to an update email from Peterson's daughter Mikhaila, the lead on this project. This arrived about a month ago, so in mid-January. The interesting parts: they're projecting having the Gen Ed curriculum in the next year and a half. Put a huge honking pin in that. They've hired a bunch of people and are fully setting up shop in Scottsdale, Arizona, where Mikhaila lives. Previously, they'd been filming in Miami, apparently. They have improved course graphics, so things presented by the lecturer in Monitor will be added in post. In poking around various courses, I can say that this is true for at least some of the newer ones, like Basics of Biology, but it is not true for the launch courses I checked, like Intro to Cosmology. Still just the flashy, style over substance pop-ups. Generally, I'm going to guess this is largely dependent on the instructor's style, sometimes to the detriment of the students. Intro Psych isn't going to be as negatively impacted by no useful supplemental visuals, especially for the parts Campbell covered, compared against Neuro. You need pictures of the brain or neurons to help. Comparing footage from launch in February, and yeah, still just the flashy pop-ups. Even for a content creator who uses slides, they didn't add them, at least for Intro to Cosmology. Quote, internally, we've developed a full general education curriculum. Add that to the pinned thought. Quote, made progress in our discussions with various jurisdictions about accreditation. That's so vague as to not really be helpful. But with the current administration, I suppose anything is possible at this point. They are increasing to 4 courses a month, up from 3. Although this comment about it being a huge achievement for the team is a little silly. With how this content's created, the largest time commitment isn't something they have to worry about. The research and the scripting is handled by the lecturers. Yeah, they're setting up the cameras, lights, chairs, and whatever the instructor needs, but with a dedicated studio, it's gonna be pretty easy. Speaking as someone who edits videos as a part of my job, I don't think one course should take an editor more than a week to get through. Unless there's something like huge chunks of lectures that have to be redone as a take sort of thing, these seem to be incredibly lightly touched, as only slight pauses seem to be cut. And if you have your editing workflow set up well, switching between cameras is easy. Popping in graphics and handling captions would also take some time, but still. Many of the time-consuming parts of creating videos are easy or non-issues. Principles of conduct, links, exams, Quote, we'll continue growing our network of companies to hire future graduates. So it's still possible Twitter could be staffed by Pearson grads, assuming the company and its owner are still around by then. And a promise of much more. While I am snarking a bit, they are making good on continuing to upload more content on a regular basis. I will give them that. This part caught my attention. Quote, extensive finals testing for degrees, thesis, and proctored exam for the final degree. The thesis and proctored exam will be heavily weighted for the final grade for anyone pursuing a degree. This will come online when the Gen Ed is ready. The issue here is that my relevant concerns from the beta have not been addressed. These videos still have the appearance of being like a college lecture, but missing the important everything else you need for a meaningful learning experience. Some classes have added some sort of textbook to the 3 recommended books they seem to be allowed, but students are going to be doing some intellectual lifting to figure out how they map onto the videos. Ideally, lectures are supposed to reinforce what the student read before class. This is basic best practices in teaching, and that is missing here. While across the platform, testing is optional, I do appreciate that for people pursuing a Peterson Academy degree, it isn't optional. That's good. What isn't good is the reliance on AI to generate the quizzes and tests. Some intent and care by the subject matter expert needs to go into these things because that doesn't seem to be happening right now. And I educatedly guess this isn't in the student's best learning interests. The whirlwind pace these are having to go means a lot of information isn't getting covered. For seminars, this is less of an issue, but you don't get any sort of degree for doing exclusively seminars. And this is being pitched as an alternative to a general education degree. Which brings us back to the central issue with the Peterson Academy. Logistically, any sort of degree doesn't add up. Before we get into this, let me just complain that I tried to find a school with a general education or general studies degree. These used to be a thing 2 decades ago. They don't seem to be anymore. Do let me know how wrong I am in the comments, but make sure you are throwing an actual Gen Ed or Gen Studies degree at me and not the general education requirements that all undergrads have to get in that school, because that is all I'm finding. On the general education requirements front, We are now looking at the info for Sacramento State because it had a nice little write-up of the purpose here. That purpose being the expectation that someone graduating with a university degree have some well-roundedness to what they learned, as opposed to only learning the info related to the graduating topic, as is the case for trade degrees. Someone holding an American university degree should have some basic English, argumentation, research, math, science, and humanities skills. Well-rounded. I do not see most of that happening with the current courses, and I kind of doubt they're going to add the basic English, math, or science courses, but who knows? Maybe they'll surprise me. For instance, if we look at the Basics of Biology course, it isn't even that. It's Cell Bio. That was a 300 level course at my undergrad. Zooming back out to the current courses, as a rough estimate, the only one of these that'd probably be fair to call a basic intro 100 level course is Intro to Cosmology. Everything else is building on basics that haven't been included. If they were proper courses and not short video series. That brings us to the other half of the logistics issue. How do the Peterson Academy watch hours map onto traditional credit hours? For this discussion, we're going to put aside the huge issue of inadequate depth. Even though it is a huge issue that should give anyone seriously considering this as an alternative to a traditional undergrad pause. The norm for a bachelor's is somewhere between 110, 120 credit hours. But I suppose the Peterson Academy could be less than straightforward about what type of gen ed degree they're offering. So, an associate's is about 60 credit hours. As we talked about in the last Peterson Academy video, one 3-credit hour class means that you would be in lecture 3 hours each week for the duration of the semester. For the purposes of argument, we're assuming a 15-week semester. Might be a little more, might be a little less. We're going with 15. That yields 45 in-class lecture hours, and that time commitment just grows when you factor in all of the out-of-class reading and homework you have to do. So, for an associate's degree, that would add up to 900 lecture hours. If they keep the pace of adding 4 8-hour courses a month, they will be able to match the associate credit hours in about 20 months. Mikhaila's 1.5 years is wildly optimistic, just on the numbers side. But that once again brings us back to the issue of the content of these videos. As became apparent in me taking this, the Peterson Academy Intro to Psychology is not equivalent to a traditional Intro to Psych. Not by a long shot. A quick look-see at Intro to Neurology suggests this won't be an isolated case. And a quick comparison of what's covered in the Basics of Biology's videos against what my undergrad cell and molecular biology textbook covered provides more support to this idea. It's just going to be a subset of what should be the entire whole. Selling these as just as good as college courses is false. It's a lie. And unless those accrediting agencies get trumped, or maybe even if they do, I don't see how a degree from the Peterson Academy is going to be worth the resources it takes to achieve it. And on that bombshell, I don't have anything else to add for now. So until next time. Bye.